Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidyakena yopakaruttam pravaram muninam patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi abahu purushakaram shankhachakrasidharinam sahasrashirasam shvetam pranamami patanjalim. Harihi Om. Vasudeva sutam devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum Sarvopanishado Gavo Dugdha Gopalanandanaha Partho Vatsaha Sudhir Bhokta Dugdham Gitamritam Mahat. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. So we have started studying the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. We studied the first verse in our previous class. Today we will proceed. We will study the 2nd and the 3rd verse, both verses which are on page number 70 and 71 on the book that is in your hand. Two of the greatest commentators of the Bhagavad Gita, one, the first one from the 8th century AD, is Shankaracharya, who took a non-dualistic approach towards the interpretation of this text. And then in the 10th century, around 200 years after him, came another great thinker, philosopher, master of India, known as Ramanujacharya. He's the greatest master in Vaishnava devotional traditions. Both of them were from South India, traveled to the north, but originated in the southern part of India. Shankaracharya's tradition became well known all over India. Ramanuja's tradition as it exists today is mostly limited in South India. Nonetheless, these two masters have had a tremendous influence on subsequent philosophers, thinkers, devotees, masters, saints, and sages. Because the philosophical aspect that they outlined with the help of the texts, the scriptures that were present in their time, that work was a great work. So Ramanujacharya, the second commentator of the 10th century, even though they are philosophically very different systems, And I myself was educated in the Shankaracharya's tradition, which is the prevailing tradition here, even in the city of Rishikesh. Swami Shivananda, Swami Vivekananda, Maharshi Mahesh Yogi, all these great masters that made Rishikesh famous in the world, made Rishikesh known in the world, they belonged to his tradition. It is often beautiful to look at other interpretations, at other traditional masters. So his grandmaster, Ramanujacharya's grandmaster, is Yamuna Muni. His name is Yamuna Muni. And why I'm mentioning him, because before we start studying the 4th chapter, what he does, in one verse, he presents the quintessence of this chapter, which will help us to understand and appreciate what this chapter is about. He says, Prasangat Swaswabhavokti. He says, first of all, Sri Krishna starts by telling his essential nature, which is not only Lord Sri Krishna's essential nature, but is the essential nature of every living being. So first of all, he starts by describing his essential nature to his student, to Arjuna. The second thing that he does, because he just finished talking about Karma Yoga, as we discussed in our previous class, the 3rd chapter was about Karma Yoga. In this chapter, Sri Krishna beautifully explains that in action, in karma, true actionlessness, real transcendence from action, the inaction that the Upanishads, the Vedas, the yogis speak about, the state in which a person transcends actions on the 3 levels, on the physical level, on the verbal level, and on the mental level. That state of actionlessness, that transcendental state, is not something for which action is given up, but it has to be found within action itself. And this is something that Sri Krishna already had touched upon in the 3rd chapter. In the very beginning of the 3rd chapter, he said, Nakarmana manarambhat naishkarmyam purushoshnute. It was on page number 53, verse number 4 of the 3rd chapter. Nakarmana manarambhat. A human being does not attain freedom from action or does not transcend actions by not performing actions. The path to actionlessness goes through action. It goes through working hard. This seems contradictory, but Sri Krishna didn't get the chance to explain this, what he means, because they seem mutually contradictory statements. Even in Sanskrit, karma means action and akarma means non-action. So when Krishna says that you cannot find akarma or naishkarmya, the state of actionlessness, without karma, what does he mean by that? So this will be explained in this 4th chapter, karmana akarmata, how there is real actionlessness within action itself. There is a lot of action in asana itself. There is a lot of action in pranayama itself. If we think that meditation is doing nothing, just sitting down and not doing anything, the way the Yoga Sutras, the way the Bhagavad Gita understands meditation, it's a lot of work with the mind. For Krishna, actionlessness is the most effort, is not doing anything, inaction, the state of not doing anything. verbally, mentally, physically, not doing anything, that is the most difficult thing to attain. But to see inaction, the real state of inaction, in action itself. And what does that mean is because we think that action, not to do anything, laziness is a natural state. But in Krishna's understanding, our very existence depends on movement. It depends on action. Whether it is the earth rotating around the sun on a macrocosmic level, or whether it is the great movement that is occurring within the body, within the cells, within the body as an organism in itself. Even when we are asleep, the mind is constantly active. The mind is, it's not, yogis knew this very well, which today scientists are discovering. Patanjali makes it very clear. That is the reason nidra, sleep, in Patanjali's understanding is a vritti. It's a modification of the mind. The mind has to work hard to create this state in which we can experience complete rest. But the mind has to be fully active. Even when we dream, there is a lot of action going on. And of course, the heart keeps on pumping. So many organs within our body never stop working. And if they just even stop working for a few seconds, that would be the death of our individual awareness. It would be the end. So everything rests on this action, on this constant movement that happens within me and within all around me. Our existence, very existence, depends on this action, and actionlessness has to be found within this action itself. In other words, like the masters explain it, one cannot stop the wheel, but one can reach the central point of that wheel where there is minimal movement, where there is very little movement. If you look at the really the center of that wheel, that is where the least movement is. So the idea is not to stop the wheel, but the idea, because that's not possible. However somebody tries, he will fall into hypocrisy. This is what Krishna made clear in the beginning of the 3rd chapter. We discussed that in great detail. He said, Mithyacharaha sa uchyate, in the 6th verse of the 3rd chapter, that such a man of deluded intellect is called a hypocrite, on page number 54. Someone who tries forcefully to enforce actionlessness over him by not doing anything with his senses of action, senses of perception, by not doing anything with his body. This is possible. We can sit for a while in meditation, not do anything. We have that much control over our senses, over our body. But what about our mind? Our mind will not stop working. It will go in all the different directions. So externally people think we are in meditation, but internally our mind is as active as it was before, and rotating, roaming here and there. That is the reason Krishna calls such a person hypocrite. So for him, the state of naishkarmya, the state of trans-active, deep meditative state, is found within action itself. This paradoxical statement, he will talk about this also in the 4th chapter, which he could not discuss in great detail in the 3rd chapter. He does that in the 4th chapter. And then he will talk about the various forms of action as they are practiced by a yogi to achieve wisdom, to achieve knowledge. He will speak of, he calls them yajna. Yajna means, if you ask somebody speaking Hindi, he will tell you that yajna means fire worship. If you have visited the evening Aarti, for example, on the other side in Paramarth Niketan, then you will see in the evening, before they do the Aarti, they have this huge fire pit, and in that fire pit, they throw some offerings with mantras. That is called yajna. That is understood as yajna. Krishna gives a very wide, extremely wide perspective of this worship, in which even we will see when we study those shlokas, even pranayama, the practice of pranayama, even the practice of asana becomes a form of worship of light which exists within us. That fire worship, it becomes a form of yajna. It becomes a form of worship. So yajna is an action. Yajna is a karma. That is why it is also called karma kanda. The Vedas are divided into three parts. Karma kanda, the part that deals with active worship. Upasana kanda, the part that deals with meditative, contemplative worship. Call it worship, you call it meditation, it doesn't make any difference. And the third part, which is jnana kanda, which deals with the quintessential wisdom that the masters achieved by performing actions selflessly and meditating at the same time, the wisdom that they found within themselves. That is referred to as jnana kanda. So he will speak about the various kinds of actions. This he does in the 4th chapter. And then jnanasya mahatmyam. And then the greatness, the great value of jnana, of wisdom. How we should approach the masters. What qualities do we require within us? How much should we prepare ourselves? Not for any other purpose, but just that we can be qualified, we can be ready, so that our utensils, our cup is ready, is clean enough, is prepared to receive that wisdom within our heart, within our consciousness. That requires some cleansing, some preparation. Sri Krishna talks about that towards the end of the 4th chapter. All these connected issues he discusses in the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. This is in a nutshell, in the quintessence of the 4th chapter as presented by Ramanujacharya's master, Yamuna Muni, a great master who is well known particularly in South India. He presents the quintessence of this 4th chapter in these words. So, what we studied in the first verse was we discussed a few characters, in the few names in the tradition of this wisdom. And the idea is to relate to it from our own perspective, because if these names are names of some historical beings, can we find them within ourselves? Is this tradition meaningful to us? The reality is that every form of wisdom is received through the same tradition that has been mentioned in the first verse. Why is it so? The first master is always aham. Aham means I, the seer, the conscious observer. That is where wisdom originates. That is where knowledge originates. If there is no conscious observer, it took centuries for the scientists to appreciate this fact. It is today, with quantum mechanics coming into the picture, that scientists are starting to appreciate the observer, are starting to include the observer into their mathematical formulas. So this conscious observer, from which without that conscious observer, there will be no one to interpret what we are seeing. So the conscious observer, that aham, that I, that is the most important thing, which, if clarified from all different levels, if all the different labels are peeled away from it, the labels that are tagged onto it, if a person gets rid, that is why masters like Maharshi Aitareya, they ask this question, they start their inquiry, which was then made popular by Ramana Maharshi in the West, this inquiry into one's own self. Who am I? But this question was asked for the first time in Rigveda's Aitareya Upanishad by Maharshi Aitareya. Atha kohamiti? If my body is doing all the work, with most of my unconsciously, without any conscious control over my body is doing all the work, then who am I? Atha kuhamiti. This question is asked by him. And when a person finds an answer to that, peels away all the accumulated baggage that a person has added to this I, this, I, that, what remains, that stands for the Supreme Lord, the ultimate source of all wisdom. In that there is nothing to create a distinction, nothing, because these labels create that distinction. These tags create that distinction. Without that, in pure consciousness itself, in contentless consciousness itself, there is nothing to create a separation. There is nothing to differentiate. So when when a self-enlightened soul uses the word aham, when he says aham brahmasmi, I am the supreme essence of this universe, his aham is not the same aham, the same confused aham, the same confused I, the same confused ego which we use. He means it from a very different perspective, from a very different level. That is the inner master, the greatest master within, which Patanjali speaks of as the Sapurveshamapi Guruhu. He is the master of all masters, Kalena Navachedat, because that pure consciousness is not limited by time. It's not limited in the sphere of time. Time itself comes into existence in it, like space itself. Then if you saw the student of this I was Vivaswan, the sun, which represents the nature. Sun is always seen as the first creation. Ahamasmi prathamajaridasya. Sometimes he is called the first son. S-O-N, not S-U-N, but S-O-N. The first son of God, the first son of Creator, which then further creates the earth and gives rise to life upon earth. So, sun, which represents nature as created by that pure consciousness, that is the second master. And that is when the witness, when the conscious observer observes the nature around him, which can be referred to by the sun, because the nature that we see all around us is ultimately a creation, we are part of that solar system. Life on this earth has its source in the light that comes from the sun. That is the reason the sun is often also referred in the Vedas as Savitaha. Savitaha means the creator, not the supreme creator, but the creator, as the source of light on this planet, the source of light, the source of life. The Upanishads call it pranaha. Sometimes they use the word prana, which means life force which is all around us, but the word prana is also sometimes used for the sun, because that is the ultimate source of life on this earth. So, all forms of wisdom, whether scientific or artistic in nature arise when the conscious observer studies and analyzes this nature that is there all around us. A scientist discovers scientific laws by studying nature. That is what a scientist does. He studies nature. What does an artist do? He looks at that nature from an artistic vision. He perceives something very different, the aesthetic beauty, and finds ways to express it by studying nature. He does the same thing. He also an artist studies nature, a scientist studies nature, and a mystic also studies nature. But what a mystic does, that he discovers spiritual laws by studying nature. He discovers psychological laws. He discovers laws that operate within our society on a deep, interconnected level between each other and in our minds. That is what he tries to discover. But the object of his study is exactly the same. So this is the secret of the Veda. That is the reason the Veda speaks so much about nature and try to worship and meditate upon external light in its all manifestations, so that the light within, this which we can only refer to metaphorically as the internal light, consciousness, which we all know, we all experience, but don't understand. We don't understand it. They get an insight into the nature of consciousness by meditating on external light. This is the secret of the Vedas. The Vedic traditions go as far as stating that if pure consciousness is the father of this universe, this energy that is inseparably present as the source of everything, as the source of all atomic and subatomic particles, time and space itself, as the source of that ultimate energy which is inseparably present in consciousness, in the understanding of the Vedic traditions. It's like in a seed, the whole tree is present, but as a potential. Shakti in Sanskrit actually should not be translated with power or energy. The perfect translation is potential, capability, because Shak means possibility, from which the word Shakti has been derived. We use this word, for example, Shaknoti Bhavan. Can you come? Is it possible for you to come? Shaknoti. In Sanskrit, we use this Shak in this sense. And from there the word Shakti has been derived, which is that potential in consciousness to create everything that we see all around us. For the sake of understanding, sometimes the consciousness aspect is referred to as the father, and the energy aspect, the Shakti aspect, is referred to as the feminine aspect or as the mother. The traditions that focus on the motherly aspect of consciousness, which is on this potential, which are referred to as the Shakta traditions, the Devi worshipper traditions, which worship the Supreme Divinity not in a male form, but in a female form. For those traditions, it is so important because their logic is that only for a child, who is the person who can tell with all authority to a child that this is your father? The child has not the capability, not the ability to know its father unless the mother tells it. So it has to come, the knowledge has to come through the mother. And this is what we find in the Upanishads. even the radiant beings, there is a beautiful story when they fell prey to their ego, to their limited sense of identity, and lost the awareness of that supreme force. And when they were eventually faced in a situation in which they were perplexed and could not understand it, what we see in Samaveda Kenopanishad is that Mother Parvati arises and she tells them the essential nature of the Supreme Self. So that is Brahma Vidya. That is the Vedic wisdom of the Self. It has to come through that. So that is the importance that nature is given in the Vedic tradition, because she's our mother. So that is the second master, Aham, I, pure consciousness. Then Vivaswan, which represents that nature, that energy. The third one, Manu, as I explained, even though he's a historical being, we are called Manavas, human beings, because we are descendants of him. The word human is related to that word Manu, even the English word from its Indo-European roots. The word Manava, Manushya, all Sanskrit words for human beings are related to him. Still, when the Vedas use it, when the Vedas say Manurbhava, become a human being, they use the word Manu simply as a human being. So that is the third master in this, is humanity itself. It is pure consciousness, it is Mother Nature, and then it is human being. A human being. Who is a human being? We discussed this in our previous class. Matva sivyati karmani. It is related to the root man, to think. Animals can't think of the results of their actions. Human beings can. They can think the results of their actions, the way those results would affect them and the wider society. Only humanity has this capability. So someone who has transcended the animal instincts, the animal tendencies, which scientifically we know because we have brought all those tendencies into this human birth. If we look at it in a modern Darwinian way, then we have inherited all those genes from our previous births as animals. We have inherited all those tendencies within us. If we look at it from a religious Hindu perspective, then the soul, the Sukshma Sharira, which means the subtle body, journeys from one body to another body. It changes bodies, sometimes becomes trees, sometimes becomes human beings, sometimes becomes animals. And all these tendencies of those animal births show up in the human birth. Even great rishis have identified traits within themselves which seem quite similar in cases with dogs, with cats, with frogs, with various animals. And that is what made them to think that these traits they would have inherited from their previous lives. So when a person transcends his animal tendencies, he receives this wisdom from the inner seer, from the inner witness, as it sees and witnesses the nature around him. So the third master in the tradition is always a conscious and aware, a thinking human being. That is the third one. And then to bring it into the wider society, for the society to appreciate it, for the society to follow it, for the society to accept it as authentic, the important thing is that the rulers of that society, those who control the wealth and the political power, for them it is important to understand this wisdom. So the fourth master, Ikshvaku, who is a Rajarshi, who is a king and a sage, who represents the ruler. when the ruler rules in accordance of these spiritual laws, spiritual principles, every member of the society benefits from them. When a king, when a ruler becomes a sage by living in his life these discovered truths, everybody in the society benefits tremendously from them. And the Vedic way of life, the Vedic teachings actually, you see this next shloka will talk about Rajarshi, about royal sages. What does this mean? To create such a sage ruler was the Vedic ideal. There are 4 Vedas which are considered the fountainhead of spirituality on this Indian subcontinent, extremely ancient texts, the most ancient texts of India, the most sacred scriptures of India. The second one is called Yajurveda, which primarily deals with ritualistic aspects of the Vedic way of life. But what are these rituals? They are not meaningless rituals. If we look at those rituals, we find that the purpose of these rituals was to produce such a ruler who lives these principles in his life. First of all, of course, there is the ritual of coronation, which is laden with heavy symbolism of childbirth. I'm not going into the details, but it's a beautiful ritual. Then the second ritual is called Ashwamedha. Ashwamedha, which declares the king a supreme ruler, in which, and this was highly misunderstood because all animals, domestics and wild as well, were brought into this ritual. And even though commentators make it very clear that after the ritual was finished, these animals had to be let free. They were not in any way sacrificed or killed. But somehow later, people started sacrificing these animals out of their own interests or whatever, I don't know. But the ritual as it is there in the Yajurveda, I have looked carefully at those commentaries, no animal was sacrificed. In any case, all these animals, domestic animals and wild animals, were brought so that the king, the purpose of the entire ritual was to destroy the animal nature within that king. That was the second thing. After which he was declared as a samrat. Samrat means a supreme emperor. Then the third one used to be Purushamedha. Ashwamedha means the killing of horse, etc., all the animals. Medha does not actually mean killing, but sacrifice of animals. Then Purushamedha. Purusha means human. And this made many Indologists to think that ancient Vedic traditions maybe had human sacrifice, which was again not the case. If we look carefully at this ritual, it was prescribed for someone who wants to acquire adishta. Adishta means the stage which transcends the society, in which a person becomes higher and greater than the society. So in that ritual, representatives of every human type and profession were brought. The Yajurveda lists around 184 professions. One human being from each profession was brought, and then they were systematically, so to say, sacrificed. The human nature, which did not mean they were killed, but it was just that the king had to sacrifice even that human nature within himself to acquire the divine nature. But where did it culminate after that? This did not allow the king to remain a king. But after that it ends that after performing this Purushamedha, Aranyam Gatva Sanyaset, the king leaves his kingdom and becomes a beggar and goes into the forest for the sake of meditation. So this was the ideal. The purpose was to transcend even the human nature, so that he can become divine. But the moment he becomes divine, he can't remain the owner. He has to become a beggar. That is when Indian culture started to call him no more Raja, but Maharaj. That is the reason we call saintly people Maharaj. Maharaj means the great king, the greatest king, the supreme kings. Because this state was considered even higher. And that is when he had to perform the last ritual, which was Sarvamedha. Sarvamedha means sacrifice of everything. In this ritual, he would sacrifice everything. The mantras of this ritual are filled with awareness of universal consciousness, of unity, of oneness. Tadeva Agnihi. In the form of fire, it is the same consciousness. Tadaditya. In the form of the sun, it's the same consciousness. Tadvayuhu, in the form of the wind, it is the same consciousness. Taduchandramaha, in the form of the moon, it is the same consciousness. Tadeva Shukram, the radiance that we see in all enlightened beings and physical objects, that is all the light of that supreme being. Tad Brahma, Ta Apaha, water is that supreme being. Like this universal consciousness of oneness, we find the mantras that have been mentioned there in the Shukla Yajurveda as filled, imbibed, saturated with this understanding of unity, understanding of oneness. In this, the emperor gave up everything. This was the time when kings like Alexander, emperors like Alexander, were dreaming of becoming supreme emperors by killing thousands and thousands of people to accumulate wealth, strength, and power. The noble kings in India were living the ideal of what they called Sarvamedha or Sarvavedas, in which they were giving away everything that they had accumulated as a king. And this is not only a mythological, that we know this from our mythological or religious records. As late as 6th century AD, when a Chinese traveler, Xuanzang, came to India, he records meeting Samrat Harshavardhana, the king of Kanyakubja, the king of Kannauj, which is a river downstream around maybe 500 or 800 kilometers along the river Ganga. From here, it's known as Kannauj. Today it is known as a city famous for its perfumes. He was a great king of there, and he had become the emperor of most of North India and was trying to gain control over South India. However, at the time when Xuanzang met him on the confluence of the river Ganga and Yamuna in Prayag, where the great Kumbh Mela occurs, he records meeting a person who was left with nothing, because he had given up at the confluence of the river Ganga and Yamuna all his accumulated wealth, all the Rajakosha, the treasure that he had accumulated, all was completely given away to the poor people, and he was left with nothing. So this used to happen in this country, and to create such kings was the purpose of the Vedic traditions, and it was most probably these great ideals that deeply influenced the countries that were adjacent to India. We find even today ruins of these ideals not only in India, but in Burma, in Laos, in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, as far as Philippines, most of Indonesia, most of Southeast Asia has been highly influenced. And actually through Buddhism, most of China, and as far as Japan. These traditions, they have deeply, even today, many Japanese monks, there are particular traditions which perform a fire ritual called what they call Goma. Goma is the same like Sanskrit Homa, which is what we were discussing, a fire ritual. They perform it every day in the morning and in the evening. If you look at the pantheon of the Chinese gods and goddesses, they are exactly the same as the Chinese and Japanese gods and goddesses. They are exactly the same. So the traditions, the teachings traveled on both sides. They reached Evelyn Underhill, who was a great author on Christian mysticism. She actually, these are her words, that in Alexandria, 3rd century Alexandria, Eastern mysticism was running wild. It was so influential there. So it influenced as far as Alexandria in the West, and in the East it went so far. Yet in the West it got eventually, through the cultural changes that occurred, everything got destroyed. In the East, it has still been preserved. When I travel to Indonesia, when I go to Thailand, I clearly find it everywhere around me. So let us pronounce the shloka, the second shloka. Evam parampara praptam imam rajarshayo viduhu sa kale neha mahata yogo nashtaha parantapa. Evam parampara praptam imam rajakshayo viduhu sakale neha mahata yogo nashtah parantapa. It was this ideal which had inspired great masters like the Buddha, who, despite being a prince, left everything behind to become a beggar all their lives. Buddha was deeply, I find it very sad that many Buddhist masters, the books that I was given by very famous masters from Southeast Asia, Thailand, etc., on Buddhism, they sometimes try to present Buddhism a little bit against the Vedic traditions. Yes, there was a lot of perversion at the time of the Buddha. That is real, that is true. But those who were perverted failed completely to understand the Vedic essence. And the Buddha attacked them, Krishna attacks them, the Vedic Upanishads themselves attack them, exactly in the same terminology as the Buddha did. But at the same time, we find beautiful statements in the Tripitakas in which Buddha is deeply respectful to the Vedic traditions. He actually calls the Vedas Brahmanidhi, the greatest treasure that humanity ever had. He calls it Brahmanidhi. This is a word that was used by him in his teachings, in his text called Brahmana Vaggo, which is a Pali text in the Tripitaka. So he's deeply, deeply respectful towards the Vedas. But yes, perversion was there. Perversions keep on coming. In the time of Christ, such perversion existed in Israel. In the time of the Sufis, such perversion existed in the Arabic countries. Mystics always come up to get rid of this perversion. So, evam parampara praptam, thus handed down from one another, Param, param. Param means one after the other. Param means the other. So parampara. Parampara means tradition, in which the wisdom is handed down by the master to the student. So in this way, traveling through this tradition, Imam Rajarshayo Viduhu, this wisdom came to be known to a chain of kings. This can be interpreted in both ways. Masters interpret in both ways. Kings and rishis. Rishis means sages. Rish means to go, someone who walks. And there is a grammatical rule in Sanskrit that every verb which has the meaning of to go also means to understand. And therefore, for example, the cognate root of go in Sanskrit, which is gam, which is cognate to go, in Sanskrit gam, we use it for asking someone, did you understand it? Avagatam bhavan, avagacchati bhavan. Do you understand? Avagatihi means understanding, the same root. Similarly, the word rishi, therefore, it means someone who has understood the essence. He is called a rishi. So either it can be interpreted as a kingly sage, a royal sage, such as we find in this translation, but this is just one possible translation. The other translation can be kings and the sages, which makes it wider. That this wisdom was received by the great kings and sages of ancient times. India has had a very long history of royal sages. Rama, Krishna, Janaka, Ashwapati, Nimi, Rantideva. So many great names are there. Buddha. Most of the masters in the Jaina tradition were actually princes. They were kings and emperors who left everything and became completely naked and roam around in the country without anything, without even cloths on their body, without completely everything, and inspired one of the most beautiful religions, which I love deeply because of its emphasis on complete non-violence, that it takes care even of tiny little creatures, tries everything not to kill them while walking, while eating, while speaking. It tries to avoid violence in every possible way. So, evam parampara praptam imam rajarshayo viduhu, they came to know this wisdom, but unfortunately, finding wisdom, teaching it to others is easy, but to preserve it over centuries requires a lot of commitment on the part of those who inherit that wisdom. And if this wisdom is not something that you can just keep in your head and keep on transmitting it. It becomes only meaningful when a person leads a life in accordance to that. That's when it gains weight. That's when we call it gurutva. Gurutva means gaining weight. What is a guru? When his wisdom has gained weight. Because guru is gravity. It's the same root. Like in Latin it is gravis. In Sanskrit it is guru. Someone who has gained weight through whose wisdom is not just in his head, but expresses through his life, expresses through everything what he does. And when a person fails doing that, then information just remains information, and it loses its essence, it loses its meanings. I deeply love Mahatma Gandhi because he says very little, he has very little to say. But you know that this person is an extremely truthful, honest person who tried everything to get rid of any kind of hypocrisy. And if he's saying something, he really means it, because he has the guts to tell everything about himself. He has nothing to hide. And when I read the same thing in his writings, even though I know it from before, I hear it from so many. But when I read it, after I have read it in Mahatma Gandhi's writings, that gives weight to it. Then to me it seems, wow, yes, this must really be true, because this man is a great man and he has lived it, he has practiced it. This is when faith, this is when devotion, this is when faith in it comes into me. Of course, ultimate conviction will only come when I have experienced it. But still, weight comes. But when that thing lacks, then wisdom starts to deteriorate. It starts to get lost over the time. This is what had happened, O Arjuna. Sakale neha mahata. As a long lapse of time passed, yogo nashtaha. This yoga, this deep wisdom, just see, yoga is singular. Even though Shri Krishna talks about so many yogas, he always only uses the word yoga in singular, because for him yoga is always one. Yoga can have many faces. A coin can have two faces, but it's one single coin. Yoga is always one. Yogo nashtaha. It became lost to most of the world, O Parantapa, but I have given it to you because you are the oppressor of para. Para means enemy. And when we talk of enemies in the spiritual subject, we always mean the six internal enemies: selfish lust, anger, greed, kama, krodha, lobha, moha, ignorance, irshya, envy, and abhimana, pride, ego. These six greatest enemies, you have worked hard to vanquish them, to get rid of them. That is why I have chosen you. He will give a few more reasons why I have chosen you. When he says lost to the world, he does not mean that it was completely lost. Obviously, he himself received it from his masters. Shri Krishna had many masters. Shri Krishna studied from Sandipani Rishi. Shri Krishna studied from Ghora Angirasa. Krishna was an amazing personality. He was deeply interested in music. He was deeply interested in painting. He was a very wonderful painter, a very little known fact, but mentioned in the Mahabharata. Krishna is an interesting personality, but it was lost to the wider world. And his point is that making you as an excuse, my purpose is to give it back in accessible language, because the Vedic language had become inaccessible to the common people. So through the text of the Bhagavad Gita, I'm representing, reinterpreting the same ancient Vedic wisdom through you. That is what I have done. So let us conclude our class today here. The next shloka still remains in this discussion, which we will study next on Wednesday. Let us conclude with a short meditation and a prayer for universal well-being, for the well-being of all beings, peace. सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः।